And speaking of the technical part of your writing, you mentioned before what Dave McKean added to Arkham Asylum, but I also think that there is in that story there is the lettering and onomatopoeic everything that make that comic unique. At a certain point, you started to experiment with your comics, and I think that one of the series which was most experimental in this point of view is Seven Soldiers of Victory. I always loved the concept of the modular storytelling that you applied, the concept itself that you applied, because at the time was completely unique, and for someone was a little bit difficult to grasp that you could read the single series or the whole miniseries altogether interlocked to give you something more. Nowadays it's something that we see more and more happening in comics. I think Jonathan Hickman comics, for instance, but also independent comics as well. But Seven Soldiers was a unique experiment at the time and something completely new. How did you come up with that, and how difficult it was to coordinate the whole project and write it as well?
Well, it wasn't so difficult. The last issue was very difficult because I had like 80 pages of material that I had to get into 40. That was the only one that was really hard. But it came about, I wanted to go back to DC, and I thought it would be really good to go back with a bunch of kind of C-list characters, not the popular characters, not the big names, because I could play more with them and mess them around a little bit. And I had at the end of X-Men, I was so desperate to escape. I had this I would finish the X-Men work for the day and then just sit in the computer and download all the stuff. So most of the first issues for Seven Soldiers were written practically overnight. There was just so much energy that I had to get out. And originally it was a couple of different characters. We had the Demon in there and someone else, and slowly it just became its final form. But what I was really trying to do was, I thought this is what life is like, and I like the idea. Number one, there's a superhero team. Well, what's the new take on it? I've done a bunch of different superhero teams that all have different takes. What's this one? Or what if they never meet and they still do all this stuff together? So I was thinking, this is how life works. You could zoom in any of our lives and get a story. And then you can do the combination of who we meet and how those stories intersect and interlock. So it was an attempt to just say, here's kind of how the world really works, and every character in there, you could zoom in and give them a 4-issue miniseries. It seemed, there was a lot of interesting characters to give you that sense of this world is so rich that we could pull out anyone. We could pull out a secondary character from Bulleteer and base a whole series on Mind Grabber Man or one of those characters. And to just give that feel of a lived-in world where people would cross paths without realizing, and their agendas would combine without them ever knowing, and it would all lead towards this kind of the spear that was fired thousands of years ago, which is a genetic line of Neanderthal people with red hair. And that is the Bulleteer, and everything is just to make sure this spear reaches its exact destination. Every little bit, every mesh of the gears and every motion of the clockwork of it was to make one thing happen. And it was just that was it, and I just started working on it from that perspective. But yeah, some of those are my favorite comics, and I love the fact that most of them were one-issue stories. And again, with All-Star Superman, it was the same feeling. I really get into it, and you can see it in my later work, Green Lantern, but it's just going back to the importance of the single-issue story and having a complete tale in there. As long as you have, as long as you have connecting tissue and a wider series arc, which brings people back month to month, but to give them a finished story. And I think a lot of television now is very like that, where we do get that model of there's a weekly story that's pretty much complete in itself, but there's always little season threads that run through and get culminate in the last one. And I think Seven Soldiers was probably played into, influence that kind of storytelling a bit.
One thing that was interesting about that is that you were also experimenting with page layouts, like graphic solutions, and it's something that when you were drawing your own stuff, like near myths and stuff, you had been doing. But when you got into mainstream comics, at some point you were not doing anymore. Like in Animal Man, the experiments, they're not the same thing as Flex Mentalo or We3 or that kind of stuff. I suppose that you never abandoned the idea of playing graphically with the page, but when did you feel comfortable enough again to go back to that kind of approach in mainstream comics? And how did
I remember specifically because I grew up with all those artists like Jim Starlin or Neil Adams who would play with the page space and the panel layouts. So I was always into that, but I just went through a pure period where I just thought, no, I just want to tell a story, and no tricks, no flashy, nothing, just tell the story. And so there's a lot of that. And then later on, sort of halfway through The Invisibles, I remember Phil Jimenez did a page, and it's like a subway train going through this weird city underground. And the way he drew it, it looked as if he drew panels that were kind of suspended in space and tilted. And I thought that's really interesting, because it made the page seem like a three-dimensional space rather than a flat surface. And so that stuck in my head. And you'll see that around the same period, sort of from late 90s, I'd do Marvel Boy, and Marvel Boy suddenly has all these attempts to, play with the panel structures, to have multiple panels to suggest fast action. And it was also, I got fed up of the dominant mode of comic storytelling, which had become filmic. It was this idea that a comic should look like a film.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, why should it? It's a nice idea. I mean, I'm fine with, let's do an opera comic, let's do a comic that looks like a stage play, let's do a comic that looks like a film, let's do a comic. But I thought everyone would get stuck in this mode. And it even went back, when people were inspired by film noir or whatever, but it became this action movie mode. And I thought, well, comics can do more than that. And I think maybe to move away from that, to go back to these ideas of multiple panels, and that tied into sort of MTV and the kind of editing that we saw in videos. So I thought, why are people dealing with a filmic approach that's now like 60 years old when we have a video approach which is much more kinetic and much more interesting, involves a lot more panels, and we could do that in comics. At the same time, the internet was really starting up, and it was the same idea with Windows. We're in panels right here, right now, having this conversation. So it began to look like the comic can mimic other structures, and it's people are more familiar with games and computer screens, and can we not make it look more like a computer screen with more windows, with more open tasks? So those were the ideas that fed into it, and you can see around that time, the JLA Classified has a lot of the same stuff, playing with panel layouts. Seven Soldiers has it, and then it came to its epic conclusion, really, with the stuff that me and Vinny were doing with We3. And that was very much, let's pursue this, let's shoot this like a video and not like a film. And so it's the multiple panels, but also the idea that the page surface doesn't have to be a surface, it can be a space, so you can rotate panels, you can turn, you can move through the space in a very different way. And I think those were really, for me, those were really exciting experiments, and to be able to work with people who could take that idea and actually make it look fantastic, like Vinny did, or like J.G. Jones did on Marvel Boy. So that's where it all came from. And I'm quite surprised that I haven't really seen anybody following that path, really. Some people have tried a little bit, but there seemed to be so much potential there, but I don't really see a lot of comics going down that road.
Yeah, maybe they think it's too Grant Morrison-y, and it needs to sit, to stay.
Well, it's like Hickman with all his graphs and stuff. Whenever anyone does graphs, and that's like Hickman.
Se questo video è piaciuto anche a voi, vi ricordo di iscrivervi al nostro canale YouTube e di cliccare soprattutto sulla campanella, in modo tale da rimanere costantemente aggiornati sui nostri prossimi video e le nostre prossime interviste. Vi ricordo anche di continuare a seguire i canali social di Panini, quindi Facebook e Instagram. Trovate tutti i link in descrizione. Io vi ringrazio tanto, vi do appuntamento al prossimo video di Panini Comics Insider. Ciao!